So welcome everyone to the Humanities Student Talks of the 6th Polygen Symposium of Rising Scholars. My name is Selena from Duke University, and I'll be moderating today's talk. So the goal of the symposium is to celebrate and showcase the hard work of our Polygen scholars, all of whom have tirelessly worked on their projects over the last couple of months. We have 4 student presenters presenting on a variety of topics today, and a fellow Polygen's mentor will be scoring each student's presentation, which will help us determine prize winners after the event. So you can feel free to type your questions in a chat, and these are going to be 4 8-minute presentations. So we're going to get started with Michelle first, and then Praja, Smita, and Karishma. So Michelle, go ahead and take it away.
Hello everyone, let me just share my screen and let's get started. So today I'll be talking about the local warming effect. So this is a psychology principle and the impact of recent fire awareness in California on sustainable advertisements effectiveness. My name is Michelle Hom. As I said before, my mentor is Daniel Esselman. And so a little bit about me. So I live in Bay Area. I'm a college freshman at Ohlone, and I have interest in sustainability, helping the planet, and psychology. And the goal of my project was to use psychology to improve sustainable ads effectiveness and help nonprofits or sustainable businesses. And today I'll be going over an introduction, questions, methods, and results. So describing the data, discussion limitations, and the conclusion of my project. So introduction. And so today, the number of acres burned almost doubled from 2019 to 2020. That's 2 times the amount, from 4.7 million to 10.1 million. And today, more consumers are willing to pay increased amounts for environmentally friendly products. So thus, with increased demand for sustainable products, there'll probably be increased demand in sustainable advertising. So I'm bringing these 2 topics together in my project. And so what is the local warming effect? So I described it as a psychology principle where if you ask the question, like, how's the weather today? Is it hot? Is it cold? And you're saying, oh yeah, it's hotter than normal. And then I follow up with question, do you think global warming is happening? You're more likely to say, yes, I think global warming is happening, or I have a higher belief that global warming is happening. And this applies beyond daily temperature, beyond asking, is it hot or cold? This can apply to weather, this can apply to flooding, air pollution, and tropical cycles. And so within my project, I use a few definitions. So we have the definition of the effect. So I define that as consumer appeal and purchase attention, and ad types. So testing different advertisements, see if the local warming effect worked. So it's the green versus filler. So greens, as you can see on the left, so it had elements of plants and sustainable. Bamboo toothbrush, pretty sustainable at that. And then filler, so we have informational, it's just plain neutral. And then emotional informational appeals to emotion, has a person on it smiling, and informational is more just plays to your rationality. So question. So my question was saying, basically they'll summing up the local warming effect. So people exposed to the recent fires information before evaluating the advertisements, and then after, and then we're the treatment group, and then in the control group, there are people who were not exposed. First, they took and evaluated the advertisements, and then they took information regarding fires. And methods. So we collected our data doing online surveys, anonymous, and we had an introduction of demographics. So these are habits, as well as habits, and then their fire awareness and consumer behavior questions with the advertisements, and sustainable questions just in general. Are you sustainable? Are you a sustainable person? And on the right and left, you can see arrows. So in the treatment group, they had the fire awareness, and then they had the consumer behavior questions. Right, in the control group, they had consumer behavior, and then fire awareness questions. So methods, this was an online survey, as I mentioned before, 59 people participated, 49 questions with average person taking about 7 minutes. So this was people were randomly placed into control group or treatment group, and we analyzed using t-tests. So this is just using p-values to see, like, yes, this difference from control to treatment group was yes by causality, we caused it using the exposure to fire awareness, or nope, I'm sorry, this was by chance, this was random. And as a result, we got a so you can see here there's high variability, and where as left on the graph you can see they kind of have a relative same pattern. So using t-tests, we had a goal of low p-pattern to say yes, this was caused by local warming effect. And then as a result here, unfortunately, we did not get as high as low as a p-test as we thought. And the lowest p-test was almost significant, but not quite. And basically, we cannot conclude that the difference was caused by fire awareness. So discussions and limitations. So the water ad, this is the water ad that had the lowest p-value. As you can see here, there was a large majority of trees and water. So trees could relate to forest fires, and water might relate to how maybe put out fires, and other advertisements were not as connected to the tree and water theme, thus suggesting maybe it might not work and might not be affected by the local warming effect using fire awareness. And we tested a variety of advertisement types and ads, so there was no uniform structure. Like not all the advertisements were like carbon copies of each other with just a product switched out. Instead, it was more different, and it included a different variety. As you saw before, there was like toothbrushes completely different in comparison to this. And then in addition, there's purchase intention does not equal buying behavior and action. So this is a problem with basically all advertisements and evaluating advertisements where purchase intention. So saying, I am a green person, I love green things. However, when actually put into practice, I do not buy green things because of maybe products or takes so much time or it's not as good as the quality. And these two differences might not be, even though we have a high purchase intention, it might not be related to a better buying behavior. And in addition, there's a small sample size relative to college students in the Bay Area. So where might the local warming effect work here in Bay Area, it might not work well in New York or in somewhere else. And that's something to consider. And conclusion. So this implies a possible use in fire awareness to increase the ad effectiveness. As you can saw before, the advertisement increased the effectiveness of purchase intention and likability. Thus, there's application that this could be used in different advertisements in different fields. And then further research should be done for fire awareness for the local warming effect. So this could be, because it has not been done before, where it has been done with tropical cyclones, but not quite with fires. And this could be testing out the water effect with the water bottle ad. So as I said before, there was a little hint that it might work on the water baths, but there should be more research regarding that. And then understanding if products could use that effect. So we use a large variety of products, but maybe focusing more on certain products and to increase sample size to create more power in causation, because we had a small sample size of 59. To increase it, we would get a better idea of, yes, this would work for like the majority of the USA. And thank you. I want to thank you, my mentor, Daniel Polygence, and my family for this opportunity. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat and I'll answer them as soon as I can. Thank you.
Talk, Michelle. That was really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. So people feel free to put your questions in the chat. And while we wait for some of those to come through, I had a question for you. How did you choose what advertisements to use and sort of, what categories of advertisements to use?
So we chose our advertising based on everyday items. So if you saw before, there were shoes or strawberries. Everyone needs these items. And however, there's like some person where my shoes I presented were tennis shoes, but they're like, I'm in the market for basketball shoes. And that increases the variability in between the two. And it was more about just choosing which items you would best apply to almost everyone.
Very cool. If anybody has other questions, you can feel free to put them in right in the chat. What do you think? What do you see moving forward with this work? Do you want to continue this or ask similar questions in further research? Or what do you think is the next step of this work?
I think the next step would probably looking at more being able to have a larger sample size as well, in addition to having applying this to more. We saw a little bit of a test like with the water bottle, but to more divulge into that and see water bottle tests and to see, as I said before, kind of maybe it only applies to reusable or plastic, and to see maybe, and as I said before, with sustainable products in general. So this would be like toothbrushes, and I guess to help the planet a little bit, to help people get up with sustainable products.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a super important topic to be studying. So hopefully you're continuing your studies in college as well. So great work. Excellent talk. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. So next we have Praja, who is going to take over and present his work to us.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Praja Tickoo, and I'm a 16-year-old student from Connecticut. Today, I'll be presenting my paper called The Role of Design Thinking in Refocusing Education System. I'm going to first introduce the background of my project and why I chose this topic, and then go over the paper I've written. So the 90s were a period of accelerated scientific discovery and human innovation. For example, in 1990, the United States launched the Hubble Space Telescope. In 1992, instant communication through text and the internet were developed. And in 1996, humans cloned the first ever living animal named Dolly the sheep. Despite this innovation, the education system began to regress. Creativity started to decline and unemployment began to rise. To understand why this began to occur, we can first look at the global picture of education during this time. World powers such as China began to increase the number of standardized tests given to students. The graph above demonstrates how testing in China increased from 4 million to nearly 7 million from 1998 to 1999, which is a 40% increase in the span of 1 year. The United States began to fall behind in test score performance, and the US politicians felt political pressure to reassess educational policies and to clearly demonstrate the success of the education system for our country. This culminated in the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, which created a greater demand for standardized testing and education. So the focus of the education system changed, as a result, leading to 3 long-term problems that we continue to see in our education system today. The first is the focus on standardized testing and standardization. Rather than focusing individually on students and student achievement, the new system of standardized testing categorizes students by test score. The second problem that emerged was content-based learning. Content-based learning focuses on memorization of content and regurgitation during tests. Rather than learning skills of critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving, students are being trained to learn skills like rote memorization and recall. The last problem that emerged as a result of this shift was an educator-employer disconnect, which resulted from educators not adequately preparing students for the workplace, but rather focusing on preparation for college or school. This lack of skills development in the education system and the educator-employer disconnect had drastic real-world implications, which have been seen over the last decade. Due to lack of skills adaptability, modern-day employees are unable to adapt to their environment, leading to huge costs to the industry and rising employee unpreparedness. Recently, employers have had to take these costs into their own hands. According to the World Economic Forum, by 2025, 73% of the workforce will be provided with programs of reskilling and upskilling. That means that students are not getting the skills they need in the education system, and the workforce is having to take this burden. This has also had real-world monetary implications. About $1,111 are spent individually on retraining employees annually, which is about $165.3 billion in North America this year alone. So what is the solution? Eliminating costs to employers by providing students with the skills necessary through the education system. The solution is design thinking. Design thinking is an iterative 5-step problem-solving process. The goal of the process is to help students better understand how to approach problem-solving through a creative and critical lens. Design thinking also helps students to develop the skills of critical thinking, problem-solving, creativity, and collaboration, which are skills that were all identified by the World Economic Forum as the most important for the jobs of the future. So the aim of my paper was to provide guidance on how design thinking could be implemented in the education system by reviewing 3 potential options. The first option I identified was teacher support and training. This would involve low-cost teacher training in the design thinking process, which would allow every teacher to become skillful with the process. The second option is to use design thinking to design curriculum. This would involve teachers using the design thinking process to problem solve around curriculum challenges and to better integrate the perspective and the needs of the students into the curriculum. The last option is teaching design thinking to students themselves. This option is one of the most impactful to students, as it involves them going through the process in conjunction with project-based learning to solve real-world problems and learn the skills necessary for the jobs of the future. So finally, looking into the next decade, my goal is to bring design thinking to the education system around the world and empower every student to take control of their own education. We are relying on a generation, or on my generation, to solve the problems necessary of the world. So it is essential that every student can be empowered with the skills necessary to make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks so much. What a cool topic. I've never heard anyone present on that before. So y'all can feel free to put questions in the chat, but I have a couple to get us started. So how did you land on this topic? What made you interested and sort of get started in this project?
Yeah, so I mean, probably a couple of years ago, I was kind of in this education system loop of like content-based learning and focusing on memorization of content and using that on tests. And I was looking for like more of a creative outlet. And design thinking emerged as like this problem-solving based creative process, which I found myself really, really loving. And I ended up doing some summer camps on it. And it's just a topic that really stuck out to me as a process that really made me feel empowered as a student. So I stumbled upon it, I think, through like an article or something. But from there on, it was more of the experience which really attracted me to the process.
That's super cool. I haven't heard anyone talk about design thinking and design learning before. So what does that look like? You talked about sort of training teachers, changing the curriculum, or teaching students directly. What are some examples? Like, what does that actually look like if you were to put that into play?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the most important kind of avenue, which I discussed in the paper, is teaching students design thinking directly. And the goal of this would be to allow students to kind of experiment with the process by selecting a real world problem and actually trying to solve it using that process. And I know like a lot of things we learn in school is very theoretical, like you kind of think about it, you maybe memorize the steps, but you never actually get to have that application aspect, or you rarely get to have that application. So I think that the goal of this process would be to have students use this process on real world problems and kind of get to interact with it in the real world.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. Looks like you have a question in the chat as well. Have you ever implemented this anywhere?
Yeah, that's one of the things, again, I also review in the research paper. So I implemented in my own school system to kind of see how it would go. And we basically worked with a group of students, 6th and 7th graders in the pandemic, to develop a solution to a problem that they noticed in the world around them. And the problem that they noticed was there were a lot of masks being thrown out because of like those disposable surgical masks. And so they developed a UV radiation machine using the design thinking process that would UV sanitize masks so that people could use them more than once. And this was just like one of the examples, but it really worked for these students because they were able to have like a meaningful impact on the world around them while also learning how to interact with members of their community at a level that's not just through the education system alone.
That's fantastic.
Thank you.
That's very, very cool. What are your last question, unless we have any more in the chat, but what are your plans moving forward with this? Do you see this tying into your career in some capacity, or is it sort of something that you're interested in on the side? What are your plans moving forward with this?
Yeah, I think my goal would be to see more research done on the connection between design thinking and those skills implemented, because obviously there's a lot of just from like observation and also from teacher observation and teachers' perspectives online, that design thinking does have this impact. But I think I'm waiting to see if there's more quantitative evidence on connection, direct connection. But my goal would be for the future to bring design thinking to as many education systems as possible across the world, really, and to empower students to have that impact on their own communities around the world.
That's fantastic. Can tell you if you're interested, that sort of design thinking and problem solving skills, they're super important if you decide to do a PhD. So that's something that you can also tie in if you're ever interested. But that was a great talk. Thank you very much for sharing with us.
Thank you.
All right, Smita, you are up next.
All right, perfect. Let me just share my screen. And I'm sorry in advance, I have allergies and those are like fully ramped up on me right now.
Oh so no, that's the worst.
I'm sorry.
You got this.
1 second. Okay. Okay, so my name is Smita Lokeshwaran. I'm 16 years old. I'm a junior in high school. And my Apologence research project was the effect of gender and age discrimination on helping behavior. And we tested saving behavior on a burning house scenario, which was hypothetical. There, okay. So, as an introduction, this experiment was conducted to test helping behavior. It was set out to see if people would pick one person over the other and examine if certain demographic factors play a role in these decisions. Many research papers test different kinds of biases. One example is an experiment conducted by Darlene Batson in 1973, where they tested if people followed the parable of the Good Samaritan and tested to see who would stop in helping while passing by a shabbily dressed person on the road. Another hypothetical situation that seems to be quite popular in the psychology field is the pond analogy. In the pond analogy, people are asked several questions pertaining to a hypothetical situation of saving a child who is drowning in a pond. First, they're asked if they would save the child. Most people would say yes in the situation. Then, another variable would be added. For instance, would you have still saved the child if you were wearing $1,000 shoes? People would still say yes to this question. However, if people were asked if they would save a child in another country with a $1,000 donation, most people do not regularly donate. In the present study, helping behavior is tested in a hypothetical scenario similar to the pond analogy. Two hypotheses were developed for the study. The first one being, there is a gender bias in helping behavior where people help to choose females more. Our second hypothesis is that there is an age bias in helping behavior, where these effects are being influenced by gender in the participant. This method was an anonymous survey distributed to approximately 250 individuals. In total, 149 responses were collected, resulting in a response rate of 59.6%. The survey was created to test if participants would change their helping behavior and based on demographic differences. To test this, a hypothetical scenario was created in which a house was burning in front of the participant. They were asked to imagine themselves in the scenario to answer questions involving it. Across 5 questions, participants were presented 2 pictures of 2 individuals. Each question involved a set of pictures with 2 individuals of the same age but different gender. Each picture had a description including the name and age of the individuals, and all the names were chosen based on typical American names such as Sam or Jack. Each picture had a blank white background, and each individual was posed in a similar way. Participants were then asked to choose between 2 pictures of a boy and girl in the same age range, which consisted of a baby, a child, a teenager, an adult, and 2 people from the elderly. The survey ended with a demographic section, including questions related to an area of residence, gender, age, and number of children. Several results can be drawn from the study. Overall, the female option from the questions were chosen 58% of the time. On the contrary, the male option was chosen 42% of the time all in all, making it so that the male's option was chosen less than the female option. However, when looking at the questions pertaining to the children, the percentages, which were 59% female and 41% male, were much closer compared to the adult percentages, which was 76% female and 24% male. The responses from all respondents are shown in graph 1, which is on your left side. Another interesting finding is that in male responses, as shown in graph 2, which is in your top right-hand corner, the lines were comparatively flat, indicating a very minimal differentiation by age. Now, when you're looking at the female respondents, which is shown in graph 3, which is in your bottom right-hand corner, they showed great differentiation by age and even overlapped in the child section. When looking at how the male option was chosen less than the female option overall, you can say that it is because females are more socially responsible according to societal norms. Going off of that, females are usually held accountable for carrying a family bloodline. As for why the percentages came closer in the child responses, it could just be that the perception that any child is a child independent of gender. People may hold a soft spot for children since they have a whole life ahead of them. When looking at how the male graphs were flat and how the female curve is indented, you could say that it is because males don't differentiate as much by age, and females differentiate by age, except when it comes to children. The findings from this experiment can contribute to other studies that have tested different variables in helping behavior. It can show that if people are predisposed to doing one thing over another as a result of certain variables. From the results, you can see that overall, people picked females. This supports the hypothesis that people would choose females more. That is what I have, and thank you.
Thanks so much. This is another really interesting topic that I really haven't been exposed to before or really thought that much about. So it was really cool to hear your study. I'm curious how you came up with your hypothesis that age and gender might play a role in this helping behavior.
So when I was first conducting this experiment, as I talked about Darley and Batson in their experiment, they had the shabbily dressed person on the road, and sometimes wouldn't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure that females had more soft spot for helping people when they saw a shabbily dressed person. And when it comes to the child, as I said in my discussion, the last slide, people might feel like sad for children or have like a soft spot or be empathetic towards children since they have a whole life ahead of them. And as for the female responses, again, they could be responsible for carrying like bloodlines or anything of that sort. It's more of like the stigma towards females and children that helped me, kind of like led me towards my hypothesis.
Yeah, super interesting to take something that, you might think is sort of just accepted in the real world. It's something that you've observed and then actually test it with a hypothesis-based approach. I think you did that really nicely.
Thank you.
What do you see yourself doing moving forward? Do you want to continue in research? Are you interested in sort of psychology research, or like what are your plans moving forward?
Yeah, so I actually want to end up in the Air Force, and I really want to combat
cool.
the female stigma when it comes to like flying planes, because I myself am a pilot. So I would love to see if I can take this research further and try to fight for advocacy and see if I can do anything to help with this female stigmatism. And I mean, obviously, as we can tell, people chose to save the females more, which means that there is a point. People do care. And it shows that there is a world out there where we can have perfect equality, which people say that we have now, but I don't think that is the case. So, yeah.
I would have to agree with you there. That's fantastic. I love that.
Thank you.
I have no doubt that you will be successful in that. So
Thank you.
Great work. Looks like we have a question from Michelle in the chat. Would you consider doing future research on how the role of race or ethnicity or childhood background might affect the results?
Yes, actually, when we were first, I might do a separate project on that or another set of research on that, but we kind of took into account our participants' demographics, as I said. So we took into account if they had any children, which actually might play a role, because if somebody were to have children, they probably would save the child, or if they had a son, they'd probably save a son because they had a son. And so that would create a very interesting project, to say the least. But yes, I would consider doing a future research project on race and ethnicity or childhood.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, thank you so much for sharing with us. That was fantastic. All right, Karishma, you are up next.
Okay. 1 second. I'm just going to restart my PowerPoint so there's no spoilers.
Totally understood.
Okay.
Just a heads up, your video is not on in case you wanted it to be on.
Oh, oops. Okay, here we go.
Awesome.
Okay. So my presentation is on, my presentation is on the ongoing and historic ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka. And that's why I've called it The Aftermath of War, Explaining Racism in Sri Lanka. So I'm going to go through the background, some facts about Sri Lanka, so you have a better understanding of what goes on there, and the names of the groups. And then I'll go through an intro of the conflict, the ancient history, some Tamil monarchies, colonization, post-independence, the Civil War, and the LTTE, today's landscape, and a call for action. So Sri Lanka is made up of a majority Sinhalese population, which you can see in the yellow part of the map, and a minority Tamil population, which is the red part of the map. Tamils have dominated the northern and eastern provinces, which is the red part of the map, and the Sinhalese dominate all other provinces. So the geographic location of Sri Lanka is actually, it is right below India. So the northern part of Sri Lanka is very close and actually used to be connected to the southern part of India. And South India is highly dominated by Indian Tamils. So there's a connection there. And so in these pictures, it could be assumed that the protests that happen in Sri Lanka are very popular and highly supported and globally known. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Unfortunately, most of the world does not know the struggles of Tamils in Sri Lanka. The symbol that is being waved in these flags is actually a symbol of a terrorist organization that fought in the Sri Lankan Civil War, known as the LTTE, or the Liberation of Tamil Tigers of Ulam. And why civilians, innocent civilians fighting for their rights, are waving that symbol of a terrorist organization is because that terrorist organization was the only force that stepped up to fight for our rights. And Tamils, some Tamils still honor and respect that organization. As you can see in this, the bottom right picture, there's a poster that says killed over 146,000 civilians, and that is referring to the massacre that ended the Civil War, where a whole town was destroyed so that the Sri Lankan government could get to one person, the leader of the LTTE. 146,000 civilians were killed, but even more went missing, and that is still the case. The ethnic conflict between the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sinhalese is not really between the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sinhalese groups, but it's between the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Sri Lankan government, who believes that the Tamils need to be eradicated or pushed off the island in order for the Sinhalese to flourish. So I believe that this conflict is actually a result of rising nationalism historically and currently between the Sinhalese and the Sri Lankan Tamils. And so I'll go into some history to explain all that, starting with the ancient history. And before we get into that, it is important to understand that the Sri Lankan government actually imposes their belief that the Sri Lankan Tamils are alien to Sri Lanka and that the Sinhalese are indigenous to Sri Lanka, which is not true. Neither groups are actually indigenous to Sri Lanka. And I'll explain that in the upcoming slides. But the Sri Lankan government is actually really forcing this belief on the next generation because they are reprinting textbooks and literally rewriting history in Sri Lanka so that the next generation has a different set of beliefs and a different view of history than what is actually fact. And all this information I've gotten from texts that I actually used in my article that I wrote with Polygents. So yeah. So two ancient tribes. There were many ancient tribes in Sri Lanka, but these two are the ones that are important to understand this conflict, are the Nagas and the Yakas. So the Nagas lived in the north of Sri Lanka, which, as you saw on the map, was populated by Tamils. And so since they were so close to South India, they were influenced by South Indian, which was Tamil culture and language. Well, South Indian culture is not just Tamil, but that was the culture and language they were influenced by. And they ended up mixing with Tamils and adopting that culture and language. So that's where Sri Lankan Tamils come from, the Nagas. And the Yakas mixed with King Vijaya's people. And King Vijaya's people came from the Bengal region of India, and they became today's Sinhalese. And this evidence is further proven by Tamil is actually a Dravidian language, an ancient Dravidian language. And Dravidian languages come from South India. And Sinhalese is an Indo-Aryan language, which is usually from North India or the Middle East. So definitely not indigenous to Sri Lanka. So Tamil monarchies in Sri Lanka, the throne of Anuradhapura is a highly Sinhalese populated kingdom. And this was invaded and ruled by Tamils for many centuries. And of course, this will be a problem for Sinhalese because it is Hindu Tamils ruling over Buddhist Sinhalese. It's also important to understand that in the Tamil population, Hinduism is the dominant religion, and in the Sinhalese population, Buddhism is the dominant religion. And so not only an ethnic clash, but there is a religious clash with Tamils ruling over the Sinhalese. So Tamils have a lot of pride and love for their culture and language, so they spread their culture through the Sinhalese kingdom. And not only did they spread their culture, but the Hindu Tamils spread Hinduism, which would conflict with what the Sinhalese believed in. And so because of this, Sinhalese nationalism quietly rose. The conflict furthered even more when the British colonized Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka was actually colonized 3 times, first by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then finally the British. But the British had the greatest impact because there were many conflicts between the Sinhalese and the British. The British attempted to spread Christianity, which conflicted with Buddhism, and they continued to spread their Western practices, which conflicted with the practices already in place that dominated Sri Lanka, because the Sinhalese were the dominant population. The British also favored Tamils in Sri Lanka over the Sinhalese and placed them in higher positions of power. And this is because the British had already colonized India and were familiar with the ways and the cultures and practices of the Tamils. So placing the Tamils in higher positions of power favored them because they could also increase trade between India and Sri Lanka, furthering their global circle, or power circle. But obviously, this favoritism caused turmoil and another surge in Sinhalese nationalism once independence was gained. After independence, Tamils led a second nationalist wave because they feared that they would lose all the luxuries they got from the British during their colonial rule. And during this time, also a new government was formed called the United National Party, which was majority Sinhalese, and they believed that Tamils were advancing at the expense of Sinhalese. And this is the belief that really furthered and pushed the conflict into what resulted in the Sri Lankan Civil War. And this is all happening in the mid-1900s. So the United National Party put laws into place to slow down the pace of advancement of Tamils, such as the education standardization. And to understand this, I wrote the example. If a straight-A Tamil student and a near-failing Sinhalese student had applied for admission at a Sri Lankan university, the Sinhalese student would have been given priority consideration and admission if the university board, and this is all under orders from the government, felt that they had given admission to enough Tamils. And by enough, I mean in some colleges, there was a strict ratio where only 25% Tamils could be admitted, while the rest had to be Sinhalese. And so this definitely restricted a lot of Tamils from even going to college in the first place if their grades did not live up, even though some Sinhalese might have worse grades or yeah. So this nationalism was really put into a public perspective. Sorry, my doorbell's ringing. When the Prime Minister Bandaranaike rose to power by empowering Sinhalese nationalistic movements. So he saw this as the best way to get to power because at the time the Sinhalese nationalistic movements were a very popular movement in the Sinhalese population, which dominated Sri Lanka, so he would get the most votes. At this time, also, Tamil was not recognized as a national language of the island, which upset the very significant Tamil population. And this caused tensions to rise even higher, and riots struck when the Tamils demanded recognition for their language and the other basic rights. So this resulted in
we're about 2 minutes over time. If you want to just move through the end of your slides, this is super interesting.
Okay, sorry about that. So the Civil War resulted from all this conflict, and that began in 1983. And this was, a result of Tamils demanding their basic civil rights. So the LTTE, the Liberation of Tamil Tigers of Elam, rose to power after claiming a land in Sri Lanka that became known as Tamil Elam. Tamil Elam was supposed to be a place, a separate country from Sri Lanka, where Tamils and not be restricted from anything. The Sri Lankan government promoted Sinhalese and Tamil nationalism, and this caused the raising animosity between the two groups. Even in today's landscape, Tamils are still mistreated. During the war, there were many massacres, including the Mulai Vaikal massacre, which was the one that resulted in 146,000 civilians being killed. Tamils are still missing since the war, and the government gives the civilians of Sri Lanka no answer. There were protests that happened at the beginning of the pandemic where Sri Lankan Tamils would walk all the way across the island. There was given no global recognition because, unfortunately, journalists are kidnapped and tortured for reporting atrocities. And the Sri Lankan government recently tore down the Mulai Vaikal massacre memorial. No reason given. They just took it away. And people are still being questioned and tortured because they're suspected of being part of the LTTE, which was actually eradicated at the end of the Civil War. Police raids still happen in Tamil homes just because they're Tamil. During the Civil War, it was really hard being a Tamil in daily life because you had to take many more steps to do basic things like get food or go to school or just go to another province just because you're a Tamil. And things like that are still happening today, just not on as grand of a scale. And to conclude my presentation, I'd like to say that as a Tamil myself, I know that it's very important to us that our language is recognized, our culture is recognized. We're very proud of it all. Unfortunately, this causes us to blur a very realistic view of the world, which is that other countries have their own problems and they need to solve their own problems before they can get to us. We can't expect other countries to solve our problems because there are other ethnic groups with their own battles. So Tamils from India, Malaysia, Singapore, Sri Lanka, all over the world need to come together in solidarity because that's the only way that the Sri Lankan government is going to recognize us as a real group and a real entity that is deserving of civil rights, any rights, basic rights, and our freedoms. It has to be nonviolent because obviously violence was not the answer. It resulted in a 30-year civil war that ended 10 years ago, a very bloody civil war. And that also caused the heavy Tamil diaspora, Tamils fleeing the Civil War and going to places like America and Canada. And it's another reason why that we don't have a strong central Tamil population in Sri Lanka because of the big Tamil diaspora. Tamils are not ready yet to come together, and it's understandable. The war only ended 10 years ago, and it's still very damaging to many. But hopefully one day they will be, one day we will be, and hopefully that will be the time that we non-violently fight for our rights and regain our freedom. Thank you. And
Thank you
I'll
so much
take
for your
you.
presentation. That was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Really important to share all of that information and yeah, great job. If you all want to put questions in the chat, you can go ahead and do that. Can ask the first question here. Karishmma, what are your next steps for this research? Do you plan to continue this research? And I mean, you had a really great call to action at the end. I think that's super important as a, to sort of put this in the big picture and say, what can we do as next steps in general, but in terms of research and presenting, do you continue to share this information places? What are your plans?
Yeah, so I definitely, I wrote my paper and I definitely want to publish that and get it out there so that people are more first of all, aware of the
Fantastic.
conflict. Yeah. And in college, I know there are like people of color, like discussions or like meetings, and I want to get involved in those things to spread this story.
Fantastic. That's great. Does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and drop them in the chat. All right. In that case, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you so much to our 4 presenters. These were phenomenal talks. I learned a lot today. I did not know much about any of these topics, and I really enjoyed hearing all of your work and your perspectives on each of these topics. So thank you so much for choosing to share with us, and thank you for all of your hard work. I hope you enjoy the rest of the symposium.
Thank you.
Thank you.